profound shift awaits those who dare to cross the ancient threshold between worlds. A journey beyond everything you thought you knew about reality itself. What secrets did the mystery schools guard so carefully? And how did they forever transform those who entered their sacred chambers? Imagine standing at the threshold between two worlds, the familiar reality you've always known, and a realm of mystery that will forever change you. In the flickering torchlight of subterranean chambers beneath the temple of Eleusis, initiates trembled as they prepared to cross such a threshold. In the vast stone halls of Egyptian pyramids, candidates for initiation fasted for days, their minds hovering between ordinary awareness and something beyond. What if I told you that these ancient initiatory rituals weren't primitive superstition, but sophisticated technologies of consciousness transformation? What if the secret knowledge guarded by mystery schools for millennia wasn't information at all, but rather a specific state of being, a profound shift in perception that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to understand? The ancients knew that we've forgotten that consciousness itself is malleable, and that certain thresholds, once crossed, change us forever. Today we journey into the psychology of initiation, the science of crossing between worlds. Welcome, fellow traveler, to a journey beyond the veil of ordinary perception. I invite you not merely as a viewer, but as a potential initiate, one who recognizes that deep within you lies the same yearning for transcendence that drove seekers to the mystery schools of old. Whether you know it consciously or not, you have already crossed many thresholds in your life. Moments where you stood suspended between who you were and who you were becoming. The ancients recognized these transitional states as sacred gateways, opportunities, not just for change, but for complete transformation of consciousness. Today, we will explore these forgotten technologies of the soul together, not as distant academic curiosities, but as living wisdom that still pulses at the heart of human experience. For the true initiatory path is not locked in dusty scrolls or buried temples. It awaits rediscovery within your own awareness, within the liminal spaces of your existence. The mysteries have never truly been hidden from those with eyes to see. They speak in the language of symbols that transcend time, in psychological patterns etched into the fabric of meaningful human experience. And today, neuroscience is finally catching up to what the hierophants and mystagogues of old always knew about the transformative potential of the human mind. Join me as we decode the sacred science of crossing between worlds. Our exploration will take us through the veiled corridors of history's most profound mystery traditions, from the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece that persisted for nearly 2,000 years, to the initiatory chambers of Egypt, where candidates faced elaborate trials of body and spirit. We'll uncover the carefully designed psychological mechanisms that made these initiations so powerfully transformative. The use of sensory deprivation and overstimulation, symbolic death and rebirth, and the deliberate creation of what psychologists now call liminal space, the fertile void between established identities where new possibilities emerge. Modern neuroscience offers unprecedented insights into what happens in the brain during transcendent experiences. We'll explore fascinating research on how altered states like those induced in ancient initiations can temporarily disrupt the brain's default mode network, dissolving the boundaries of the self and opening consciousness to mystical experiences of unity and interconnection. Yet this journey isn't merely academic. The wisdom of the mystery schools offers profound guidance for navigating the initiatory thresholds in our own lives. Those moments of transition, challenge, and transformation that shape our becoming. By understanding their psychological mechanics, we can consciously engage with these threshold experiences as opportunities for genuine initiation into greater awareness. The ancient mysteries have always been hiding in plain sight, waiting for those ready to perceive them. Let us now part the veil and step into their sacred wisdom. By mystery, we mean a series of cults, religious practices, and rites developed and spread in antiquity throughout the Greek and Mediterranean world, as scholars have noted, characterized by an initiatory path, which gave gradual access to knowledge and to a following personal advancement. These were not casual spiritual practices, but profound systems designed to systematically transform consciousness through stages of revelation. The word mystery itself comes from the Greek mysteria, combining maio, meaning to close, as in closing one's mouth in secrecy or closing one's eyes to go within, and tyria, meaning festival. This etymology reveals the dual nature of the mysteries. They were both deeply internal experiences and communal celebrations, uniting personal transformation with collective ritual. Among the most renowned were the Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, which flourished for nearly 2 millennia from approximately 1450 BCE to 392 CE. These mysteries centered on the myth of Persephone's abduction to the underworld and Demeter's quest to recover her daughter, a powerful metaphor for the soul's journey through darkness and return to light. The initiatory process was carefully structured. The mysteries began with the March of the Mystai, initiates, in solemn procession from Athens to Eleusis, historical accounts tell us. Before this journey, candidates underwent purification rites at the lesser mysteries, followed months later by more profound ceremonies at the greater mysteries. This staged approach was deliberate. The psyche needed preparation before it could withstand the full revelation. In ancient Egypt, the initiatory tradition was equally sophisticated. Candidates underwent long periods of study, fasting, and ritual before being admitted to the inner teachings. One had to understand the motions of celestial objects and be attuned with their energies if they were to become a high priest or priestess. Egyptian initiations were cosmic in scope, aligning human consciousness with celestial cycles and divine principles. What distinguishes mystery traditions across cultures was their requirement for secrecy. Initiates were bound by solemn oaths never to reveal what they had experienced within the sacred chambers. The main characteristic of these religious schools was the secrecy associated with the particulars of the initiation and the ritual practice, which may not be revealed to outsiders. This veil of secrecy serves multiple purposes. It protected sacred knowledge from misuse and ensured that each initiate would have a direct, unmediated experience rather than a preconceived notion of what to expect. This secrecy has made it challenging for modern scholars to fully reconstruct these ancient practices. Yet, enough evidence remains in fragments of texts, archaeological findings, and writings of ancient philosophers to recognize their sophisticated psychological methodology. The mystery schools were not practicing primitive superstition. They were operating with a profound understanding of human consciousness and its capacity for transformation. In ancient, pre-axial age cultures, from ancient Egypt to the British Isles, to Vedic India and the Himalayas, to South America, Chaldea, Sumeria, ancient Greece, Babylon, and others, there were esoteric traditions of initiation that guided men and women to awaken as souls, then to awaken as the One, and then to embody that on earth. This description reveals that behind their diversity, mystery traditions shared a common understanding of human potential and the stages of its unfolding. The first key to understanding initiation psychology lies in what happens in the brain during transformative experiences. Recent neuroscientific research offers remarkable insights into the neural correlates of the mystical states that ancient initiations sought to induce. Studies examining brain activity during profound altered states have identified the default mode network, DMN, as crucial to understanding transformative experiences. The DMN is a network of interconnected brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on the external world, when our minds are wandering, reflecting on ourselves, or thinking about the past or future. It's considered by many neuroscientists to be sautandrate, the source of the ego, the notion of self, and an identification with the thoughts, emotions, and roles one plays in the world. What's fascinating is that during mystical experiences, whether induced through meditation, psychedelics, which were likely used in some ancient mystery traditions, or other means, researchers observe a reduction in neural activity in the major centers of the brain, including the default mode network. This temporary dampening of the DMN appears to correlate with experiences of ego dissolution, the sense that the boundary between self and world is dissolving. This neurological insight helps explain why mystery schools designed initiations that deliberately disrupted ordinary consciousness through combinations of fasting, sensory manipulation, symbolic dramas, and in some cases, ingestion of psychoactive substances. They created conditions that would temporarily quiet the brain's default mode of operation, allowing initiates to experience reality beyond the constraints of their ordinary identity. A fascinating parallel comes from recent research on general anesthesia, where scientists discovered that telepathic anesthesia shifts the functional connectivity of the human brain away from its usual patterns. While anesthesia itself wasn't used in ancient initiations, this research demonstrates how profoundly our experience of reality depends on specific brain states that can be deliberately altered. Even more intriguing, this research reveals that under anesthesia, the human brain becomes less distinguishable from each other, but also less distinguishable from the brains of other primates. This suggests that our uniquely human consciousness, our sense of individual identity separated from others and from nature, requires active maintenance by specific neural patterns. When these patterns are temporarily disrupted, as they were in mystery school initiations, boundaries dissolve and a more fundamental, unified consciousness emerges. The mystery schools understood empirically what science now confirms, that consciousness is malleable, and that under certain conditions, the boundaries of the self can be temporarily dissolved, allowing for experiences of unity, transcendence, and connection with something greater than the individual ego. The second key to understanding initiation psychology lies in the concept of liminality, the threshold state between established identities or realities. Anthropologists and psychologists have recognized this as a universal element in transformative rituals across cultures. Liminality derives from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. It describes physical, physiological, and psychological transition zones, the area between your starting point and your destination. In initiatory contexts, liminality is deliberately induced to create the psychological conditions necessary for transformation. Victor Turner, a pioneering researcher in this field, described liminality as an anti-structural state that exists outside normal social boundaries and categories. During liminal periods, individuals exist in a state of ambiguity, having left behind their previous identity but not yet integrated a new one. This state can be disorienting and even frightening. But it's precisely this dissolution of familiar structures that creates the possibility for profound change. According to Turner, all liminality must eventually dissolve, for it is a state of great intensity that cannot exist very long without some sort of structure to stabilize it. This temporary nature of liminality explains why mystery initiations were carefully structured experiences with clear beginnings and endings. They created containers for transformative intensity that would have been unsustainable in everyday life. The mystery schools expertly engineered liminal experiences. Consider the Eleusinian mysteries, where initiates participated in a ritual procession from Athens to Eleusis, symbolically leaving behind their ordinary world. They then underwent fasting and other preparatory rites before entering the telesterion, or Hall of Initiation, where the secret ceremonies took place. This progression deliberately moved participants through increasingly liminal states, culminating in whatever revelatory experience awaited in the inner sanctum. What happens psychologically during such liminal experiences? Research suggests that when we're removed from familiar contexts and certainties, our minds become more receptive to new patterns of thinking and being. The protective structures of our ordinary identity temporarily loosen, allowing for what Turner called spontaneous communitas, a direct, immediate experience of human connection beyond social roles and hierarchies. This explains why many mystery traditions incorporated elements that would be disorienting or challenging, from fasting and sleep deprivation to confusing symbolic narratives and surprising sensory experiences. By disrupting ordinary mental patterns, they created a psychological opening through which new awareness could enter. The mystery schools understood that transformation occurs not through comfortable, predictable experiences, but through encounters with the unknown that challenge our existing frameworks. As one contemporary practitioner of ritual notes, Beneton, initiation is that shift of consciousness that takes us beyond our comfortable, known world. We have crossed the boundary line, and we have changed along with our view of the world. How might we apply this ancient wisdom about initiation and liminality in our modern lives? While we can't exactly recreate the Eleusinian mysteries in our living rooms, we can recognize and consciously engage with the natural thresholds that appear throughout our lives. Every significant transition, career changes, relationships beginning or ending, relocations, losses, even internal shifts in belief or identity, creates a natural liminal space. Rather than rushing through these transitions or numbing the discomfort they bring, we might approach them as the ancients approached their mysteries, as sacred opportunities for transformation. Research on modern rite of passage experiences suggests that acknowledging transitions through ritualized forms can have significant psychological benefits. However, as one study on college initiation ceremonies found, not all modern attempts at initiation are equally effective or ethical. The difference lies in intention and design. Whether the experience is created to foster genuine transformation or merely to establish hierarchical power. An ethical modern approach to initiation honors the wisdom of ancient traditions while adapting their insights to contemporary understanding. The key elements to preserve include, first, preparation. The mystery schools never thrust unprepared initiates into their most profound experiences. Modern initiations similarly benefit from conscious preparation, whether through study, reflection, or preliminary practices that ready the mind and heart for transformation. Second, liminality creates a clear demarcation between ordinary life and the initiatory space. This might be achieved through retreat, fasting, meditation, or simply through creating dedicated time and space set apart from daily routines. Third, community and witness. While many modern spiritual seekers emphasize individual practice, the mystery traditions understood the importance of initiation taking place within a held container of community. Having witnesses to our transitions, whether mentors, friends, or fellow initiates, helps integrate and validate the experience. Finally, integration of the mysteries didn't end with the revelatory experience, but included guidance for incorporating that experience into daily life. Similarly, modern initiatory work requires time for reflection, meaning-making, and gradual incorporation of insights into ordinary awareness. One contemporary approach draws on the power of ritual postures, specific body positions that may have been used in ancient initiatory contexts to facilitate altered states of consciousness. Researchers have found that a physiological shift accompanies and supports the shift of consciousness and can be the trigger to achieve altered states of consciousness. This suggests that even simple physical practices, when approached with intention, can create initiatory experiences. The psychological research on initiation offers another important insight that the intensity of the initiatory experience correlates with the strength of connection felt afterward. Studies show that individuals who undergo an unpleasant initiation to become members of a group increase their liking for the group. This helps explain why difficult transitions, when consciously navigated as initiations, can lead to profound gifts of increased meaning and connection. By recognizing the initiatory potential in life's transitions, we can transform what might otherwise be merely disorienting experiences into opportunities for genuine evolution of consciousness. When we step back and examine the phenomenon of initiation across cultures and throughout history, a transcendent pattern emerges, one that connects individual transformation to collective evolution and cosmic principles. The mystery schools didn't see initiation as merely a personal psychological process, but as participation in a universal pattern of death and rebirth, darkness and illumination, fragmentation and wholeness. The Eleusinian mysteries centered on Persephone's descent to the underworld and return to the surface. The Egyptian mysteries worked with Osiris's death and resurrection. And other traditions had their own symbolic narratives of this fundamental cycle. These weren't merely cultural stories. They reflected a profound understanding of consciousness itself. As researcher Marjorie Woolacott observes in her studies of mystical experiences, despite their different etiologies, three types of spiritually transformative experiences, near-death experiences, psilocybin experiences, and meditative experiences of cosmic consciousness appear to have attributes that are common to a broad range of mystical experiences, including an experience of expanded awareness. This suggests that the transformative states cultivated in mystery traditions access something fundamental about human consciousness, patterns of awareness that transcend cultural and historical contexts. The experiences of ancient initiates and those of modern experimental subjects in neuroscience laboratories may be accessing the same underlying capacities of the human mind. Moreover, research shows that these experiences can have lasting transformative effects. Studies indicate that all three types of spiritual experiences appear to be associated with profound and lasting transformations in the lives of experiencers. The ancient mystery schools knew that they weren't creating temporary altered states for entertainment, but deliberately invoking experiences that would permanently shift the initiate's relationship with reality. This transformative potential connects individual initiation to collective human evolution. The mystery schools served as centers not just for personal growth, but for cultural advancement, with many initiated individuals going on to become philosophical, artistic, and political leaders in their societies. The mysteries played a central role in ancient cultures as pathways of self-development, transformation, and awakening, through which many of those who would go on to play significant roles in society would pass. From this transcendent perspective, we can see initiation not merely as a personal psychological process, but as participation in the evolution of human consciousness itself. Each individual who undergoes authentic initiation, whether through traditional means or through conscious engagement with life's natural thresholds, contributes to the expansion of what's possible for human awareness. As our journey through the psychology of ancient initiations draws to a close, we stand together at yet another threshold. The boundary between intellectual understanding and lived experience, between knowing about the mysteries and entering into them. The ancient initiates knew that true wisdom could never be fully conveyed through words alone. It must be experienced, embodied, lived. The mysteries have always been waiting, hidden in plain sight within the fabric of your own consciousness. They speak in the language of symbols that resonate in the deepest chambers of your psyche. They whisper in moments of synchronicity, in dreams that linger upon waking, in fleeting experiences of connection that transcend ordinary understanding. Every threshold you face contains initiatory potential. Every challenge, transition, loss, or awakening offers a doorway between worlds. Will you pass through unconsciously, clinging to the familiar shore of what you've known? Or will you step forward with the courage of the ancient initiates, willing to be transformed by what awaits beyond the veil? The true mystery schools never died. They simply changed form. Today they exist wherever consciousness meets its own depths, wherever the egoic self encounters its limitations and discovers something greater. They exist in moments of creative inspiration, in profound meditation, in the silent space between heartbeats, in the recognition of your own face, in the eyes of a stranger. The hierophants and mystagogues of old understood that initiation is not something done to you, but something you participate in with your whole being. They created elaborate ceremonies and tests, not to withhold knowledge, but to ensure that when revelation came, you would be ready to receive it, to be transformed by it, rather than destroyed. That same invitation echoes across the centuries to where you sit right now. The thresholds await your conscious crossing. The mysteries remain alive, breathing just beneath the surface of ordinary perception. The ancient wisdom of initiation continues to unfold within the temple of your own awareness. Will you accept the invitation? Will you step through the doorway between worlds? The choice, as it has always been, remains yours to make. Before diving into our exploration of consciousness across traditions, let me share what awaits you on this profound journey. Throughout history, mystics and spiritual seekers have created intricate maps of consciousness, navigational tools for the inner realms that exist beyond ordinary awareness. Today, we'll discover how these seemingly disparate systems, from Kabbalah to Buddhism to Hermeticism to shamanism, may actually be describing the same experiential territories using different symbolic languages. By the end of our journey, you'll possess a comprehensive metamap for understanding your own inner experiences and states of consciousness that transcend everyday awareness. What if I told you that the map of your mind, the very landscape of your consciousness, was charted thousands of years ago? That ancient traditions across the globe, separated by vast distances and cultures, somehow arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about the territory of human consciousness. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the space of awareness within which all your thoughts and sensations arise. This seemingly simple space, this field of consciousness, is actually a vast, multi-dimensional realm with distinct territories, landmarks, and boundaries that mystics have been mapping for millennia. Soul traveler, you have likely felt it before, those moments when your consciousness shifts, when perception alters, when reality seems to breathe with a deeper meaning that ordinary language struggles to capture. Perhaps during deep meditation, or in a moment of profound insight, or even in the space between waking and dreaming. What you may not realize is that these experiences aren't random or merely subjective. They represent movements of your consciousness across territories that have been meticulously mapped by traditions worldwide. Whether you've known it or not, you've been traversing realms that ancient wisdom traditions have documented in astonishing detail. Tonight, I invite you to join me in exploring these sacred cartographies of consciousness maps, drawn not with ink and paper, but with symbols, metaphors, and direct mystical experience. Together, We'll discover how these maps can illuminate your own inner journey and reveal the common ground where all spiritual paths ultimately converge. Our expedition will take us across 4 major mapping systems of consciousness. We'll ascend the branches of the Kabbalistic tree of life, where 10 divine emanations create a blueprint of reality from the highest spiritual realms to our physical existence. We'll walk through the 6 realms of Buddhist cosmology, understanding how these aren't just afterlife destinations, but states of mind we experience daily. We'll journey through the upper, middle, and lower worlds of shamanic traditions, accessing different dimensions of reality through the axis mundi, the world tree that connects all planes of existence. And we'll explore the mental, physical, and spiritual planes of Hermetic wisdom, uncovering how, as above, so below, reveals the fractal nature of consciousness across all levels of reality. By the end of our journey, you'll possess not just knowledge of these systems, but a metamap, a unified understanding of consciousness that transcends any single tradition. This isn't mere theory, it's a practical framework for navigating your own expanded states of awareness. Long before modern psychology attempted to map the human psyche, ancient wisdom traditions recognized that consciousness extended far beyond our ordinary waking state. These traditions understood that reality is multi-layered, with consciousness operating across numerous dimensions simultaneously. In the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, which dates back thousands of years, the Tree of Life emerged as perhaps the most comprehensive map of consciousness ever devised. This sacred geometry reveals 10 sephirot, or emanation spheres of divine energy that flow from the infinite source down into manifest reality. Each sephira represents not just a cosmic principle, but a state of consciousness accessible to the human mind. You are the Tree of Life in human form, teaches modern Kabbalistic wisdom, a microcosmic reflection of the universe. To begin to realize this is to consciously inhibit your body and to live within awareness of non-duality. Meanwhile, across the Himalayan plateau, Buddhist sages were developing their own sophisticated cartography of consciousness through the 6 realms model. This wasn't merely a cosmological map, but a profound psychological system describing the various states of mind humans experience, from the blissful God realms to the tormented hell realms. As Mingyur Rinpoche explains, in Tibetan Buddhism, we map out 6 realms to investigate the main mental afflictions that bind us to samsara. The 6 realms of samsaric existence are divided into the 3 lower and 3 higher realms. In indigenous cultures worldwide, shamanic practitioners developed the 3 worlds model: upper, middle, and lower, accessed through altered states of consciousness. These weren't mere mythological constructs, but experiential realms entered through disciplined spiritual practice. And in the Western esoteric tradition, Hermetic philosophy offered yet another map. In Hermeticism, there are 3 great planes: the mental plane, physical plane, and spiritual plane, which have varying lesser planes between them that also differ in degree between undifferentiated matter and spirit. The first profound revelation that emerges from studying these various maps is that they're not describing different territories, but rather the same inner landscape, viewed through different cultural and symbolic lenses. Consider how the Kabbalistic Tree of Life divides reality into 4 worlds: Atziluth, divine emanation; Baraya, creation; Yetzirah, formation; and Asaya, action or manifestation. This bears striking similarity to the Hermetic conception of planes of consciousness described as layers of concentric circles, where the inner layers are more foundational and influence the outer layers. When we examine the Buddhist 6 realms, gods, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings, we find they correspond remarkably well to psychological states identified in other traditions. The realm of gods, characterized by pleasure, wealth, and power, but lacking compassion, mirrors what Hermetic teachings call the plane of human consciousness in its higher aspects. The Rosicrucian tradition, closely related to Hermetic wisdom, describes how, on these three higher planes of consciousness, the individual soul manifests self-consciousness, or the consciousness of I am, in at least a certain degree. While on the lower four planes, this consciousness of I is entirely absent, and the mental activity is more or less automatic and instinctive. This corresponds with the Buddhist division between the three higher realms, good fortunate, of gods, demigods, and humans, versus the three lower realms, evil, unfortunate, of animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. What emerges is a stunning recognition. Across traditions, sages identified similar structures of consciousness, only differing in how they articulated and symbolized these experiences. But the metacartography of consciousness reveals even deeper mysteries when we examine the transitions between these states or realms. In the Kabbalistic tree of life, consciousness moves along 22 pathways connecting the 10 Sephirot, each associated with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. These pathways represent states of transition, the movement of consciousness between stable points represented by the Sephirot. Similarly, in Buddhist cosmology, consciousness transitions between realms based on karma patterns of thought, emotion, and action that generate momentum towards certain states of awareness. The first three paths are known as the three benevolent destinies, Kusalagati, where beings experience varying degrees of virtue, pleasure, and pain. The last three paths are referred to as the three unbenevolent destinies, Akusalagati, where beings lack virtue and suffer predominantly. A fascinating parallel emerges in the shamanic three worlds model, where consciousness journeys along an axis mundi, often visualized as a world tree or cosmic pillar to access different realms of reality. This mirrors the Kabbalistic concept of the tree of life as both macrocosmic, universal, and microcosmic within the human being. The Hermetic tradition speaks of planes interpenetrating themselves and the physical planet in which we live, the solar systems, and all the physical structures of the universe. This interpenetration of planes culminates in the universe itself as a physically structured, dynamic, and evolutive expression. Here we encounter a profound paradox. These maps suggest that consciousness simultaneously exists at all levels, yet our ordinary awareness identifies with only one level at a time. We are, in essence, multidimensional beings experiencing a focused slice of our total existence. As David Kimes Smith explains in his work on esoteric cartography, a metacartography is the highest category of esoteric cartography, which is a type of sacred image unaffiliated with either organized religion or secular culture. The cartographer gives their entire life over to the process to become an open channel for the sublime mystery at the heart of all things. But how do we practically apply this metamap of consciousness in our daily lives? How do we navigate these realms with intention rather than being unconsciously pulled between them? First, recognition is essential. By understanding the architecture of consciousness described across traditions, we can better identify which realm or plane we're experiencing at any given moment. When you notice yourself consumed by sensory pleasures without compassion for others, recognize this as the God realm of Buddhism, or the higher aspects of what Hermetic traditions call the plane of human consciousness. When you feel trapped in repetitive patterns of fear and aggression, this corresponds to the hell realms in Buddhism, or the lower aspects of the Hermetic plane of human consciousness. The Kabbalistic tree of life offers practical insight into our psychological movements. The three pillars, severity, left, equilibrium, middle, and mercy, right, represent fundamental energetic tendencies in consciousness. When we're rigid and judgmental, we've moved into the pillar of severity. When we're excessively permissive, we've swung to the pillar of mercy. Wisdom lies in finding the middle pillar of balance. Shamanic wisdom teaches us that accessing the upper world brings connection with divine guidance, while journeys to the lower world connect us with primal power and ancestral wisdom. The middle world, both ordinary and non-ordinary, is where we integrate these insights into everyday life. As the Northern School of Esoteric Wisdom teaches, it's important to find someone who has already achieved a degree of success using these tools and accomplishing the results that you are focused on achieving. We need guides who have traversed these territories before us. Practical methods for navigating these maps include meditation to stabilize awareness and observe transitions between states, ritual and symbolic work to consciously engage with specific levels. Shadow work to transform lower realm experiences. Contemplation of sacred texts that describe these territories. Community practice with others, exploring similar maps from the vantage point where all these maps converge. A transcendent perspective emerges, one that reveals the ultimate purpose of these cartographies of consciousness. These maps aren't merely describing what is, but pointing toward what could be. They chart not only the territory of consciousness as it commonly manifests, but also the extraordinary possibilities of human awareness when fully developed. In Kabbalah, the entire tree of life exists within each person, yet most live primarily identified with Malkuth, the physical realm. The spiritual journey involves awakening to progressively higher Sephirot, ultimately realizing connection with Keter the crown, representing pure divine consciousness. Buddhism similarly teaches that while we cycle through the 6 realms, the potential for liberation of Buddha nature exists within beings of all realms. The ultimate goal isn't to permanently inhabit the God realms, but to transcend the wheel of samsara altogether through enlightenment. As the Rosicrucian teachings explain, beyond all the planes of consciousness, existing the highest plane of all, the plane of the gods, to which all the rest is as but a faint shadow of the reality. This convergence of traditions points to a profound truth. The purpose of mapping consciousness isn't merely to understand where we are, but to illuminate where we can go to show that states of consciousness considered extraordinary or mystical are actually our birthright. The metamap reveals that spiritual evolution isn't about leaving behind the lower aspects of consciousness, but integrating all levels into a coherent whole. Just as the Kabbalistic tree represents a unified system where divine light flows through all Sephirot, our journey involves bringing awareness to all aspects of our being. As explorers of consciousness have discovered across centuries and cultures, these maps ultimately point beyond themselves to the mapmaker pure awareness itself, which transcends all categories, yet gives rise to them all. Soul Traveler, as our journey through the cartographies of consciousness comes to a close, I invite you to recognize that you stand at the threshold of worlds within worlds. Within worlds, territories of mind and spirit that await your conscious exploration. The ancient wisdom traditions have gifted us these maps, not as abstract philosophical systems, but as practical guides for the greatest adventure possible. The journey into the fullness of your own consciousness. Remember that these maps, while profound, are not the territory itself. They are fingers pointing to the moon, not the moon itself. The territory can only be known through direct experience, through your own conscious exploration of these inner realms. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, notice the transitions of consciousness. As you meditate tomorrow, observe the qualities of awareness that arise. In your interactions with others, recognize which realm or plane is operating in each moment. The mystic poet Rumi once wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. This is the ultimate revelation of all esoteric cartography, that the macrocosm exists within the microcosm, that the entire map of consciousness lives within you. I invite you to continue this journey beyond our time together today, to study these traditions more deeply, to practice the techniques they offer for shifting consciousness intentionally, and to create your own living map based on direct experience. For in the end, you are not merely the explorer of these territories. You are the territory itself, consciousness mapping its own infinite nature. And that, dear viewer, is the greatest mystery and the greatest revelation of all. Until we meet again on the journey beyond the veil, I am your fellow traveler in consciousness. Before you witnessed the dawn of language, your ancestors knew each other's minds without words. The ancient mystery schools preserve this forgotten birthright, a technology of consciousness that transcends time, space, and the limitations of the physical senses. Today we journey into these sacred traditions to reclaim what was once universally known: the art of direct mind-to-mind communion. What if the most advanced communication technology wasn't created in Silicon Valley, but was perfected thousands of years ago in the secret chambers of ancient temples? Have you ever known exactly who was calling before you answered the phone? Felt someone's gaze intensely upon you before turning to meet their eyes? Or experienced that uncanny moment when a friend or loved one gives voice to the exact thought forming in your own mind? These aren't mere coincidences. They echo faint whispers of a profound capacity that once flowed more freely through human consciousness. A capacity that was not just acknowledged, but systematically developed within the hallowed halls of the mystery schools of antiquity. The ancient initiates understood something that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. The mind is not confined to the brain, and thoughts are not imprisoned within our skulls. They are vibrations in the universal field of consciousness, transmittable, receivable, and with proper training, controllable. You are not merely a passive observer in this exploration. As a soul traveler on the journey of awakening, you've likely experienced moments when the veil between minds grew thin. Perhaps you felt the weight of unspoken emotions from others, sensed danger before it manifested, or received insights that seemed to come from beyond your personal experience. These glimpses are not anomalies, but invitations, calls from your deeper nature to reclaim a birthright that belongs to all humanity, but has been forgotten in our rush toward external technologies. While we've been focusing our attention outward, creating ever more sophisticated devices to connect us, we've neglected the inner technology of direct knowing that requires no devices at all. The mystery schools of ancient Greece, Egypt, and beyond understood that telepathic communion was not a supernatural gift bestowed upon a lucky few, but a natural capacity that could be cultivated through specific disciplines and ritual practices. They created systematic approaches to developing these abilities, approaches that were hidden from the uninitiated but preserved in symbols, metaphors, and practices passed down through generations of seekers. Tonight, I invite you to walk through the veiled doorways of these ancient temples, to glimpse the methods they used, and to consider how these forgotten technologies of consciousness might be reclaimed in our modern world. Our journey will take us across time and tradition, exploring the evidence for telepathic practices in the mystery schools of antiquity and tracing their influence through the centuries. We'll examine the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, where initiates participated in sacred rituals that reportedly opened channels of direct perception. We'll discover how the Hermetic tradition preserved teachings about the mental nature of the universe and the transmissibility of thought. We'll explore the three distinct forms of telepathy recognized in the ageless wisdom traditions. Instinctual telepathy that we share with the animal kingdom. Mental telepathy that operates through the focused transmission of thought. and the higher spiritual telepathy that connects soul to soul beyond the limitations of personal consciousness. We'll consider how certain plants, preparations, and ceremonial environments may have enhanced these natural human capacities, looking at both ancient accounts and modern research into states of consciousness. And most importantly, we'll discuss how you might begin to develop your own telepathic sensitivity through ethical practice and dedicated training. This is not merely historical speculation or metaphysical theory. It is an exploration of practical wisdom that has the potential to transform how we understand ourselves and our connection to others. The mystery schools of antiquity were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated systems for the transformation of consciousness. They were the universities of the ancient world, but they taught subjects far beyond the material sciences. They were concerned with the development of the whole human being, including faculties that modern education largely ignores. Among the most renowned were the Eleusinian mysteries, held annually for nearly 2,000 years at Eleusis near Athens. These ceremonies centered around the myth of Demeter and Persephone. But they were far more than mythological reenactments. They were carefully orchestrated experiences designed to induce profound states of consciousness in which direct knowing could occur. The Eleusinian mysteries present a compelling case of ancient people's pursuit of spiritual enlightenment and mental fortitude, inviting us to consider what may have truly led to their transformative experiences. According to the philosopher Cicero, who was himself an initiate, we have learned from them the beginnings of life and have gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope. What made these experiences so transformative? The ancient accounts tell us that initiates achieved states of consciousness in which direct knowledge was imparted not through words, but through experience. Some scholars believe this included forms of telepathic communion facilitated by the ritual drinking of kykeon, a sacred beverage that may have contained psychoactive ingredients derived from ergot, a fungus containing compounds similar to LSD. The Orphic mysteries represented another significant tradition that emphasized the soul's journey after death and how best to purify it. The Orphics believed that within each person was a divine spark, which was a fragment of the god Dionysus, that linked humans to the divine realm. This understanding of our inherent divinity formed the foundation for practices designed to access higher dimensions of awareness. These mystery traditions were not isolated phenomena, but part of a global pattern. From the temple complexes of Egypt to the cave sanctuaries of India, from the oracle centers of Greece to the stone circles of Britain, ancient cultures around the world created spaces dedicated to the development of higher perception. The first key revelation from these ancient traditions is that telepathy is not a single phenomenon, but exists in the multiple forms, each corresponding to different levels of human awareness. In the ageless wisdom teachings preserved through figures such as Helena Blavatsky and Alice Bailey, 3 distinct types of telepathic communion are described, each utilizing different aspects of our energetic anatomy. The first and most basic is instinctual telepathy, which operates primarily through the solar plexus center, the third chakra in the body's subtle energy system. This form of telepathy is emotion-based and instinctual, allowing one person to register the feelings or needs of another at a distance. We share this capacity with the animal kingdom, and it remains particularly strong between people with deep emotional bonds. Parents and children, lovers, close friends. As Colleen Morrow explains in her work on spiritual telepathy, the kahunas, the native priests of Hawaii, believe that telepathic messages are sent directly from one solar plexus to another. They described an etheric substance that extends like threads between people, creating pathways along which telepathic impressions can travel. The second form is mental telepathy, the mind-to-mind transmission of clearly formulated thoughts. This higher form of telepathy utilizes the higher centers of consciousness and requires greater mental focus and clarity. Unlike mediumship or channeling, true mental telepathy occurs between fully conscious, focused minds. The Hermetic teachings articulate this principle clearly. Every thought, emotion, or mental state has its corresponding rate and mode of vibration. And by an effort of the will of the person or of other persons, these mental states may be reproduced, just as a musical tone may be reproduced by causing an instrument to vibrate at a certain rate. This is the type of telepathy that has been most extensively studied in laboratory settings, including the Ganzfeld experiments that attempt to create conditions where one person transmits specific images or information to a receiver in a state of mild sensory deprivation. The third and highest form is spiritual or soul-to-soul telepathy, which transcends personal consciousness and connects with the universal or divine mind. Spiritual or soul-to-soul telepathy is the highest type of telepathy. This type of telepathy utilizes the higher levels of the mental plane, as described in the ageless wisdom literature. Through the soul, we have access to the universal or divine mind, where information on all subjects can be found. This highest form of telepathic communion was the ultimate goal of mystery school training, not merely the transmission of thoughts between individuals, but direct access to universal knowledge. The deeper mystery lies in understanding how the ancient schools created conditions for enhancing these natural human capacities. The evidence suggests they employed a sophisticated combination of setting, substance, and ceremony to open channels of direct perception. The Eleusinian mysteries culminated in the drinking of kykeon, described in the Homeric hymn to Demeter as a mixture of barley, water, and pennyroyal. But many scholars now believe this simple description concealed a more complex preparation. In their groundbreaking work, The Road to Eleusis, researchers R. Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, and Carl A. P. Ruck proposed that the kykeon may have contained ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains psychoactive alkaloids similar to LSD. As explained in their work, within the kinds of ergot produced by various species, types of ergot do exist that contain hallucinogenic alkaloids. With the techniques and equipment available in antiquity, it was therefore easy to prepare a hallucinogenic extract from suitable kinds of ergot. This hypothesis would explain how thousands of initiates over nearly 2 millennia could consistently experience profound revelatory states during the culminating ceremony of the mysteries. The altered state of consciousness induced by such substances might have enhanced natural telepathic sensitivity, temporarily dissolving the boundaries of the individual mind. But substances were only one element in a carefully orchestrated experience. The setting was equally important. The telesterion, or initiation hall, at Eleusis was designed to create specific acoustic and visual effects. As noted in research on the Eleusinian mysteries, the melodious and beautiful voice of an unseen hierophant inside the smaller shrine within the larger telesterion was not just for aesthetic purposes, but instead was required to create a sense of awe within the initiates. Modern research validates this connection between altered states and enhanced telepathic sensitivity. A study published in the International Journal for the Study of New Religions found that participants who used entheogenic substances reported telepathic contact between friends or partners who used entheogens together. And in their most intense form, these experiences involved what was described as a mind blending, where one's usual sense of selfhood dissolved into the telepathic unity. The Hermetic tradition offers another perspective on the mechanisms of telepathic communication. According to the Kabbalion, all manifestations of thought, emotion, reason, will, or desire or any mental state or condition are accompanied by vibrations, a portion of which are thrown off and which tend to affect the minds of other persons by induction. This is the principle which produces the phenomena of telepathy. This vibrational understanding of telepathy aligns with the first Hermetic principle of mentalism, which states that netat, the all is mind, the universe is mental. If reality is fundamentally mental in nature, then telepathic communion becomes not an anomaly, but an expression of the underlying unity of consciousness. How might we begin to reclaim these lost arts of perception in our modern world? The ancient teachings offer practical guidance that remains relevant today. First and foremost is the ethical foundation. The mystery schools universally emphasize that higher perceptual abilities must be developed alongside moral awareness. Without ethical grounding, enhanced perception can lead to manipulation, invasion of privacy, or other harms. In the realm of psychic guidance, the pursuit of clarity and insight intertwines with ethical considerations. Ethical psychic practice recognizes the delicate nature of influence and is committed to empowering rather than ensnaring. As the philosopher Albert Einstein wisely noted, the most important human endeavor is the striving for morality in our actions. Our inner balance and even our very existence depend on it. An ethical approach to developing telepathic sensitivity begins with respect for boundaries. Just as we wouldn't read another person's diary without permission, we should not attempt to access their thoughts without consent. The goal is not to gain power over others, but to enhance genuine communication and understanding. With this ethical foundation in place, specific practices can help develop telepathic sensitivity. Meditation is perhaps the most fundamental, as it trains the mind to become still enough to perceive subtle impressions. Research indicates that meditation not only increases mindfulness, but also enhances paranormal experiences of precognition, telepathy, clairvoyance, and synchronicities. Begin with basic mindfulness practice, simply observing your thoughts without judgment or attachment. As your mind becomes quieter, you create space to notice impressions that may originate beyond your personal thought stream. Practice with a trusted friend, taking turns sending and receiving simple images or concepts. Start with basic shapes or colors and progress to more complex ideas as your sensitivity develops. Keep detailed records of your experiences, noting both successes and failures. Pay special attention to those moments of spontaneous telepathic connection in daily life. The phone that rings just as you think of someone, the email that arrives answering a question in your mind. Rather than dismissing these as coincidences, recognize them as glimpses of a capacity that can be developed with conscious attention. Remember that telepathic sensitivity often emerges first in dreams or meditative states, when the analytical mind is less dominant. Keep a dream journal, noting any instances of information received that you later verify in waking life. Above all, approach this work with patience and discernment. Telepathic abilities develop gradually for most people, and the process cannot be forced. Trust your experience, but verify what can be verified, maintaining a balance between openness and critical thinking. From a transcendent perspective, the development of telepathic sensitivity is not merely about acquiring an interesting skill or proving the existence of paranormal abilities. It represents a crucial step in human evolution, the emergence of a more interconnected form of consciousness that transcends the limitations of individual identity. The ancient mystery schools understood that developing this capacity was not merely a personal achievement, but a service to collective evolution. As more individuals awakened to their telepathic potential, they created a subtle network of consciousness that could receive and transmit higher wisdom. In the Orphic mysteries, Initiates learned that the soul's ultimate goal was to escape the cycle of reincarnation and achieve eternal bliss. This escape wasn't merely personal salvation, but transcendence into a higher state of consciousness, where direct communion with the divine and with other souls became possible. This perspective helps explain why telepathic training was embedded within spiritual traditions rather than treated as an isolated psychic ability. The goal was not to produce psychic parlor tricks, but to create individuals who could serve as clear channels for the transmission of universal wisdom. Spiritual telepathy provides access to what the ageless wisdom traditions call the universal or divine mind, a realm where information on all subjects can be found. As Colleen Mauro writes, "In the past, it's been only the special people, our saints, shamans, and spiritual leaders, who have had access to the higher worlds. But we can all gain access to that universal wellspring of inspiration and knowledge. In our modern world, where communication technologies have ironically led to increasing isolation and polarization, the recovery of direct heart-to-heart and mind-to-mind connection offers a path toward genuine understanding across the barriers that divide us. Imagine a world where conflicts could be resolved through direct empathic knowledge of another's experience, where wisdom could be transmitted without the distortions of language, where the artificial boundaries between self and other become permeable, revealing our essential unity. This is not merely a utopian fantasy, but a glimpse of the next stage in our collective development, a stage that was anticipated and prepared for by the mystery schools of antiquity. They preserved these teachings through ages of materialism, knowing that the time would come when humanity would be ready to reclaim its telepathic birthright. As our journey draws to a close, I invite you to see yourself as part of an unbroken lineage of seekers who have recognized that human consciousness contains dimensions yet unexplored, capacities yet unrealized. The mystery school initiates of ancient times were not fundamentally different from you. They simply devoted themselves to systematic development of the same latent abilities that stir within your consciousness. The same divine spark that animated their quest for direct knowing burns within you. Begin where you are. Notice the subtle impressions that arise in moments of stillness. Pay attention to the knowing that comes without words, the connections that transcend physical proximity. Trust these experiences enough to explore them further, but maintain the discernment to test and verify what can be tested. Remember that telepathic sensitivity is not separate from your spiritual development, but an integral part of it. As you dissolve the illusion of separation between yourself and others, you naturally become more receptive to the thoughts, feelings, and needs of those around you. The recovery of telepathic communion represents a return to wholeness, a remembering of what we have always been beneath the fragmentation of modern consciousness. It is not something new to be gained, but something essential to be reclaimed. And so I leave you with this invitation. In the silence between thoughts, in the space between heartbeats, listen for the subtle voice of direct knowing. It has never ceased speaking. We have only forgotten how to hear. The ancient mystery schools knew what modern science is, rediscovering that consciousness is not confined within the skull, but exists in a field that connects all beings. By reclaiming the lost arts of telepathic communion, we don't just recover an interesting ability. We take a crucial step toward the next phase of human evolution, a phase of genuine connection, compassion, and collective wisdom. The veil between minds is thinner than you know. The wisdom to guide you is available. The journey awaits.